out of this.
Q. Hughes Road has the story.
Stand by. Stand by. And dissolve.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations.
September 26, 1960, the first televised presidential debate. There were 75 million viewers. It was the defining moment when television began to dominate politics. Vice President Richard Nixon was convinced he could defeat his opponent, John F. Kennedy. But he would be judged not by what he said, but by how he looked.
Kennedy arrived tan, handsome. He was the personification of the matinee idol. At one point, I looked at Nixon on camera, and he looked like death warmed over.
But when you answer, I will cut to that camera so that the home audience is on the Kennedy camera and the home audience is on the Nixon.
And I said to Kennedy, would you like some makeup? And he said, no, I don't want any makeup. And Nixon overheard that. Nixon needed makeup. Kennedy didn't. So he said, gee, I don't think I want any makeup either. He needed it.
Mr. Vice President's
Richard Nixon would never forget how the television camera destroyed his political dream.
Had Nixon worn makeup that night, he might have won that debate. Now, that's a terrible thing to ponder, that a man running for President of the United States runs his ship aground over pancake makeup.
We are for programs in addition, which will see that our medical care for the aged is much better handled than it is at the present time.
The Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged. I think Mr. Nixon...
Kennedy's advisors learned a new commandment. The television image is the key to molding public opinion.
Want to lead the United States?
The majority of people who saw the debate, and I underline the word saw, believed Kennedy had won. But the majority of the person who heard the debate, hadn't seen it, thought Nixon had won. That showed the debate that Kennedy had a charismatic way of dealing with the public through television, and that's why, because when he became president, I went to him and said, look, you've got to have live televised press conferences.
Thank you.
Kennedy used the press conferences as just another part of his image-making machine.
It is increasingly clear.
He was just a swashbuckler. He was so confident. It might have been Errol Flynn in the movies. And that's why he did so well, and that's why he and Pierre and the others in the White House knew that they could get away with the dangers of live television.
Mrs. Kennedy, I want to thank you for letting us visit your official home.
Television created an electromagnetic fantasy land. The public was seduced.
Now, if you'll forgive me, this room looks a little bit like an antique dealer's dream. Have you made any good finds lately?
Well, we have. This little chest was left by President Van Buren to his grandson. It has writing inside it, which shows all that. If a future First Family doesn't want it, it goes to the Smithsonian, where it will be taken care of and displayed.
The whole of America had its face against that candy store window pane. They were the beautiful people, moneyed, fashionable, handsome, living the life everybody would like to live. So it made very good television. Kennedy allowed the family to be used in, and to use it himself, in a very, almost blatant way. I remember seeing this in real life. Caroline hiding under his desk in the Oval Office and dancing around. Kennedy was, and his people, were the master manipulators of television.
But Kennedy would also use television to take the country on a bold new path. During the civil rights struggle, the dramatic pictures on television had a profound impact on shaping public policy. The leaders of the civil rights movement understood that television could be their unwitting ally, and they courted the camera.
All of us had this sense that, you know, newspaper coverage is one thing, but if you can get pictures taken of this activity, it's something else, because it's more immediate, it's more real, it resonates more with people. And so my job was to invite this coverage. Cameras, in a way, were a kind of insurance against violence. But if violence did occur, you wanted the cameras to be there to take those pictures.
Why don't you get out front of the camera and go on? It doesn't matter if you're in front of
a matter of facing your sheriff and facing your judge. We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote.
Television obviously liked this activity.
Hide your blows.
The moral balance between the good and the evil was so clear.
I was shocked the first time I went south and saw these things. Absolutely shocked. And then what happened, I think, my shock, in effect, that same sense of shock, was transmitted all over America when they saw these pictures.
The South saw the TV camera as a hostile intruder.
Somebody came up behind me and hit me with an axe handle. And some local guy walked up to me and he said, "You need a doctor?" And I was sort of shaking my head and saying, "Yeah, I think so. I think I'm bleeding." Then he thrust his face right up into mine and said, "Well, we don't have doctors for people like you."
If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. Let freedom ring.
Television allowed a Baptist preacher, Dr. Martin Luther King, to speak to an entire nation. His message, nonviolence.
I am convinced that the most potent weapon available to oppress people as they struggle for freedom and justice is a weapon of nonviolence.
I always felt that one of the ironies of King and his nonviolent movement was that he needed violence. He needed it. And if he went into a town and nothing happened, nothing would get on television.
Let's have two in this. Here where you pick.
In 1962, Martin Luther King led several protest marches in Albany, Georgia. But Police Chief Laurie Pritchett ordered his men not to react with violence when the cameras were rolling. There were no horrifying images. The march failed.
I'm under orders to keep walking.
King moved the protest to Birmingham, Alabama, where he would be met by Bull Connor, who fit the image of a Southern sheriff.
They chose Birmingham because it was perhaps the most segregated big city in the South at the time. But more important, it had Bull Connor. And they knew how Bull Connor would react. And Bull Connor reacted as though we were following a script.
If this had never been on the network news, if it had never been anything but newspaper stories, I think, and an occasional photograph, it wouldn't have done it. It was television. It was seeing people treated in that way. It was seeing the policemen beat people. It was seeing people down. It was seeing the dogs charge and bite people. It was seeing the hoses. It was seeing it and knowing that it had happened just the day before.
The White House sensed a shift in public opinion. The brutality must end.
The events in Birmingham have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Kennedy then introduced the first legislation ever to outlaw segregation. He was now ready to challenge the Southern politicians who were determined to block any civil rights bill.
All indications were that Congress would block it, turn it down, filibuster it. The question of timing, when could it be put forward with maximum impact so that it was not an empty political gesture, but to have a chance? It was the events in Birmingham and elsewhere in the South and the televised publication into the homes of ordinary American people that made that timing just right for June 1963.
Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it is not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
That was the moment that Walter Cronkite became more than a broadcaster. 200 million people hold hands around a television set, and what they say in effect is, Father Cronkite tell us everything's going to be all right.
I wasn't attempting to play national psychiatrist in this case at all. If there was something in the way I covered it that accomplished that, well, I'm grateful, but I don't feel I'm due any plaudits for it, nor can I explain it.
The public watched with loathing to catch a glimpse of the man who killed the president, Lee Harvey Oswald.
Captain Fritz. There is the president. There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Can you imagine you're sitting there and you're watching television and all of a sudden this fellow Oswald comes out and a shadowy figure comes out from behind and fires 2 bullets into that man? I mean, it's like non-fiction. It is fiction. It is, truth is stranger than fiction, and there you were. That there was no denying what television was and was going to be.
I think it was a time when Americans really stood together and television provided a national church. They could worship together.
The casket bearing the body of the late president now emerges into the sunshine.
I think the greatest picture I've ever seen was the picture of young JFK coming out of the church and saluting the casket of his father.
I did get home and was told about the silence in the streets, that people weren't driving, they weren't walking, they were, very little business was being done, and everyone was glued to television. That was the first time I sensed the impact of what we had done. And I said to myself, I'm glad I don't work for a newspaper, because if all of America is watching all of this, what's left to write about?
This is a scale model of a gallows. By putting a man's neck into the noose and springing open the trap door, 713 Canadians since Confederation have been hanged by the neck until they were dead. Another 581 have been sentenced to death and then reprieved. Of these...
In 1964, one program acquired a power that the government resented.
I would like to turn you to the question of the American Negro.
Let's go. We've got a little more sympathy there. People don't know about the Jews, but they can sure coons.
I think this theory that the larger the woman's bosom, the smaller the brain is both ridiculous and false.
The show would resort to shock tactics and mutilation. 7 days made its reputation by tormenting politicians, and it attained an audience of over 3 million viewers.
Well, 7 days ruffled a lot of feathers. I mean, that was its concept, that was its job, was to kind of upset the orthodoxies of the day.
When did you find out, as Minister of Justice, that Mr. Banks had fled the coup?
Was there or was there not enough evidence to lay charge in 1959? And in this case, a straight charge.
The 7 days trademark was the hot seat, a torture chamber for politicians.
Out of Canada.
Well, there surely was no deal of that.
Surely under those circumstances.
Never before in history were cabinet members subjected to such a public inquisition. Prime Minister Pearson tried to ban his cabinet from the show.
There was a tendency for ministers to feel that they were being badgered, or they were being bullied, or they were being intimidated, or they were being cast because of the bear pit setting, and that they were being placed at a disadvantage, being made to look guilty as charged.
He was a junior civil servant. What did he do? Sort mail?
I think he was a postal clerk.
And yet he sold information for the espionage, the Russian espionage ring.
I'm not sure that he sold it. I think he procured some information.
There were major complaints, for example, about the kind of editing they did. And you know that, as is typical in this business, you know, they would shoot half an hour and use 6 minutes of it if you were lucky. Well, they quite often edited for drama.
And information for which they were willing to pay thousands of dollars.
Every time that we would do something which would irritate a member of parliament, high cabinet official, high government official, there was bloodletting. I mean, there was fireworks. And the government was very uncomfortable in having an instrument that it paid for, being the CBC, attacking the government.
36 days from now, we have to let all those politicians know what we think of them.
7 days try to embarrass the Prime Minister and other leaders into appearing on the hot seat by extending on-air invitation.
And we think they have a responsibility to hear your views and to answer.
The CBC was furious.
That became a showdown item. We thought about it very carefully. We thought it was deeply unfair. And we ended up saying, okay, if you insist on that, we're out of here. You don't have a show.
We call on the leaders of all the parties to enter it.
CBC backed down. 7 days then challenged the Prime Minister by showing an empty chair.
The invitation is extended. Gentlemen, we await your replies.
I thought toward the end those guys were out of control. I mean, and sure, drawing 3 million people is important, but by any means? I mean, are there no standards?
It's our 7 days, some sun, a little rain.
We were well aware that the head of the CBC and particularly the members of the board of directors were getting phone calls from all the powers that be, establishment, government, politicians, and they were being told they should do something to curb this program. And they set out to do that, and they did it pretty effectively.
After 2 seasons, 7 days was pulled off the air. There was an angry public outcry, but the show that deliberately set out to challenge authority was reduced to a mere meme.
Super. This is what the war in Vietnam is all about.
In the United States, there would be an even more toxic relationship between government and television. It was in Vietnam that presidents and generals saw television as an enemy. By this time, a landmark poll had revealed that more Americans were getting their news from television than from newspapers. And the White House soon learned that pictures can be hazardous to foreign policy.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about. The old and the very young. Means of burned this old couple's cottage because fire was come from here. Now when you walk into the village, you see...
The war between television and the White House began August 5th, 1965. CBS reporter Morley Safer was invited by a platoon of Marines to film a search and destroy mission.
Shortly after, an officer told me he had orders to go in and level the string of hamlets that surrounds Cam Knee Village.
I got a call from a friend at the embassy who said the shit is hitting the fan on this, just so you know.
Did you set fire to these houses here?
No, where did you thought you left it when it was burning?
Were you getting fire from them?
Somewhat, not too much.
For President Johnson, the story was a salvo aimed right at the White House war policy. He tried to pressure the executives of CBS into removing Safer from Vietnam.
The women and the old men who remain will never forget that August afternoon.
I was privy to a meeting in Washington between President Johnson, Frank Stanton, who was then head of CBS, where the president worked over Frank Stanton unmercifully about the caliber and nature of the coverage CBS was giving and how it was inaccurate and destroying morale and so on. And because Morley was Canadian, he really threatened Frank Stanton with exposing Morley as having been politically questionable in the past.
The Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, a close advisor to the president, was convinced that Safer had staged the entire story.
To his death, and he told me this, he believes the following. I was a KGB operative. I paid a platoon of young Marines to go in, mock up the village, got Vietnamese to go in, gave them the lighters, and told them to destroy the village so we could film it. To his dying day, Dean Rusk believed it.
But what was more disturbing for the White House were the pictures of dead and wounded Americans that seemed to be burned onto the television screens.
Oh, I'll be so glad to go home. I don't know. It's the worst era I've been in since I've been in Vietnam.
You think it's worth it?
Yeah, I don't know. They say we're fighting for something. I don't know.
What you have is a recipe for a presidential disaster. You're unable to fight a war over a long period of time with television. We were unable to counter the squalid, bloody depictions on screen of young men getting blown away every night of every week. And there is no counter rebuttal to that.
January 31st, 1968. The North Vietnamese launched the most daring assault of the war, the Tet Offensive. The television reports were alarming.
These well-coordinated attacks occurred throughout South Vietnam, but the most dramatic demonstration of his boldness came at the very symbol of America's presence in Vietnam, the brand new U.S. Embassy building there. CBS News correspondent Robert Shackney reports.
Military police got back into the compound of the $2.5 million embassy complex at dawn. Before that, a platoon of Viet Cong were in control.
Television images of the Tet Offensive did as much destruction to the administration's policies in Vietnam as anything that ever happened.
All told, 5 Americans were killed during the day.
I couldn't believe what I was seeing on television. It stunned me. Was President Johnson shocked? Of course he was.
What was so tormenting to him was that Tet, as a military operation, was a total disaster for the Viet Cong. They lost 40,000 people. You go back to Tet and say, well, now, wait a minute. We won an unbelievably brilliant military victory. People say, oh, come on, get off of it. You guys damn near lost your embassy.
The brutality of the Vietnam War was brought home in one telling broadcast when General Lo An, an ally of the Americans, executed a suspected informant on the streets of Saigon.
I saw that tape, and I saw General Lo An blow the top of the man's head off. And Shad Northshield said to me, where do we stop this? Because you saw a lot of blood spurting out. You saw the man falling on the ground and the blood still coming out of the top of his head. And I said, cut it when the bullet hits the skull. The execution was added to people's feeling that this is just horrible. This is just terrible. Why are we involved in a thing like this? People were just sickened by it, and I think that added to the feeling that the war was the wrong war in the wrong place.
Tonight, report from Vietnam by Walter Cronkite.
If the communist intention was to take and seize the cities, they came closer here at Hue than...
When America's most trusted anchor, Walter Cronkite, went into Vietnam, the impact would be devastating for President Johnson.
By the time we'd gotten to Tet, I was very concerned that our
military was not telling us the full truth of the nature of our involvement, and that we were over-committed.
As a matter of fact, the whole measure of the success of this war had been that we were pushing out from the secure cities, pacifying the countryside around them in an increasingly widening ring. Now all that seemed to be knocked into a cocked hat.
And then when the military, Westmoreland was saying that another 150 or 200,000 troops would do the job, one had to say, well, wait a minute, hold on a minute. Is this a bottomless pit?
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who had been wrong in the past.
Johnson now was faced with an editorial that had a circulation several times greater than that of the New York Times.
Told him what Cronkite had said, and he made the comment to me that if he had lost Cronkite, he'd probably lost the people.
But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victims, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
2 months after Tet, Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
An unpopular war and a deceptive military in the age of television was a lethal combination.
I think Johnson was coming to a point where he was furious with the military over misleading him. And I think that he was at the breaking point when we did our report. As I say, maybe a very small straw on his back.
Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.
The British Trade Commissioner in Montreal, James Richard Cross, is reported to have been kidnapped a short while ago from his red...
Still a port was seized by 4 or 5 men.
In October 1970, Canada was plunged into its most serious crisis since World War II.
The Labour Minister was on his way out to dinner with his wife and had stopped playing football with some...
Within a week, FLQ terrorists had kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross and Quebec Cabinet Minister Pierre Laporte.
2 men, one armed with a...
The FLQ had switched strategy.
The terrorists appear to be able to strike at will, and the government is powerless to stop them.
No one was ever really safe.
I think that by the time winter comes, there'll be blood.
On television newscasts, there were stories that suggested the FLQ could commit even more violent acts. The government was concerned that the terrorists were trying to use television as their national stage.
Instead of being very sober in the coverage, they were even indulging in some processes that are not excusable in any situation, and least of all in a political crisis, of course.
Gerard Pelletier, a former journalist, called the head of CBC, George Davidson, to complain about the network's coverage.
I said, listen, it's not the minister speaking to the president of the CBC. It's a journalist speaking to another journalist. I will not recommend anything you should do. It's your duty. You are responsible. I just want to share impressions with you. Do you feel that the kind of coverage that I just described is the right one?
All right, now.
Peter Truman says the phone call was direct government interference.
Information's in there. We have
A minister of the Crown cannot phone the head of a Crown corporation and say, I am speaking to you as a friend or as a journalist or as anything other than a minister of the Crown. And tell him that, suggest to him that there are certain things he ought to do or not to do, and expect that it would not be taken as an official word.
The impact on the newsroom was immediate. There were directives issued. severely restricting the type of commentary and panel discussions the CBC could broadcast. Knowlton Nash issued those directives.
The country's future is at stake if we're going to lose this country in a revolution. But I don't mind giving up a little bit of the freedom that we had the night before last in order to protect the country from doing that.
Let's feel it a duty to do everything.
Nash now says he overreacted to government pressure.
On what's happening.
The message shouldn't have gone that far, and basically it was my fault. We went too far then, farther than we should have.
The directives were modified, but Peter Truman says they lived on in spirit. Throughout the crisis, there was an uneasy air of anxiety in the newsroom about how to react to the government. CBC reporter Tim Rafe encountered a combatant Prime Minister Trudeau on Parliament Hill.
Sir, what is it with all these men with guns around here?
Have you noticed?
Yeah, I've noticed them. I wonder, you people decided to have them.
What's your worry?
And there was pressure on us to get Trudeau to say something. I mean, this thing had been going on at this point close to 2 weeks. He had said nothing.
I'm worried about living in a town that's full of people with guns running around in it.
Are you? Have they done anything to you? Have they pushed you around or anything?
They've pushed around friends of mine.
I watched the interview on a monitor as it was being done, and I hit the roof.
Is that against the law?
No, not at all.
It was not, in those days, in my view, place of a CBC reporter to argue and to attack in front of the Prime Minister.
Would it have been impossible to protect cabinet ministers of the provincial government or diplomats?
I would suspect so. With all the diplomats there are in this country.
Ah, we got the army.
You're going to use it up pretty fast at this rate.
What do you mean at this rate? It's impossible to use the word.
Peter Truman was so upset that he insisted that Rafe's more aggressive questions be edited out.
The government's PR people, I suppose they were, issued a transcript of the total interview because they were outraged that we'd taken Rafe out of it. Because, and I asked them why, because they felt that the Prime Minister had looked so good in relation to Rafe that they certainly couldn't resist it.
There's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed.
Trudeau was so smart. He knew he had an opportunity here, and he manipulated the situation to be able to get across the points he wanted to make in the manner in which he wanted to make it. I think he was in control.
It's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of
At any cost? Any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
It was very revealing, I think, of what they're thinking of was what Trudeau's thinking was in this whole situation. And the fact was that 2 days later, they brought in the War Measures Act for the first time peacetime in this country. Never done before.
The War Measures Act gives sweeping powers to the government. It also suspends the operation of the Canadian Bill of Rights.
Trudeau said the country was on the verge of a civil uprising. Hundreds of Quebecers were arrested. The vast majority had no connection with the FLQ. Less than 48 hours after the War Measures Act was invoked, Pierre Laporte was found, murdered. The country almost unanimously supported Trudeau. Inside the newsroom, the question of whether a state of insurrection existed was not even a subject of scrutiny.
I don't think we did assign anybody to go and look into the facts on which the government was basing its actions. So it wasn't that investigative reporting was being practiced in Canada. It's just that we didn't do a hell of a lot of it at the CBC. And I've got to take my share of the blame for the fact that we didn't.
And I think now probably journalists would ask the question much more quickly, is this just assertion, or where is the evidence to back it up? And that's the question that we didn't ask ourselves. It's a question we should have asked ourselves.
Nixon will win the 26 electoral votes of Illinois.
When Richard Nixon became president, he already harbored a deep distrust for the television networks. He was convinced the networks were filled with Eastern-educated liberals who would try to undermine his presidency. His first strategy was to try to outflank the TV reporters.
Richard Nixon called Henry Kissinger and me in one day, and he said,
What's Walter Cronkite going to say in the first minute and a half tonight on CBS News? Henry looked at me and I looked at him, and the president said, don't you understand, you can control what Walter Cronkite says the first minute and a half. We've got a chance here to really dominate the network news on all three networks. Now, get busy.
But the television cameras kept focusing on the anti-war protests that were gnawing away at his popularity. So Nixon decided to do what he knew best, speak directly to the American people and bypass the press.
Many Americans have lost confidence in what their government has told them about our policy. And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority,
his appeal to the silent majority struck a chord with the audience.
I pledged in my campaign for the presidency,
President Nixon's popularity soared.
That we could win the peace.
With me in our CBS studios are my colleagues, CBS diplomatic correspondent Marvin Calvin, our national.
The networks then followed with a critique of his speech.
In your judgment,
Nixon was furious.
Saying, what in your judgment is going to be the reaction in this country to the president's speech?
Well, first, Dan, I'm not sure, but it seemed at first that the speech cut no new ground. It seemed a soft-spoken, straight-in-the-eye restatement of policy that clearly is not aimed at that group of Americans dubbed by Vice President Agnew as an effete corps of impudent snobs. Rather, it was aimed, as the president put it, at you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans.
Nixon exploded, went into a series of epithets which I will not use, called me, of all things, a Romanian agent. God knows where he came up with that one. And he sicked his government on me, which meant IRS checks, that is your income tax, would be checked every single year. My telephone was tapped. My office was broken into. I was tailed when I coveted stores. It was a mess.
Period. I just asked where you were. I was forgetting.
President Nixon then unleashed Vice President Spiro Agnew on the networks.
And the people of this country have the right to make up their own minds and form their own opinions about a presidential address without having the president's words and thoughts characterized through the prejudices of hostile critics before they can even be digested.
How dare they? How dare these cheap journalists comment on what a president of the United States has just said? They have no right to do that. Who are they?
Is it not fair and relevant to question its concentration in the hands of a tiny enclosed fraternity of privileged men elected by no one and enjoying a monopoly sanctioned and licensed by government?
I was asked my reaction to Spiro Agnew, and I said he's full of crap. I got back to New York, and Reuben Frank, the president of NBC News, called me in and said, why did you have to say Agnew was full of crap? I said, you want another synonym?
It certainly stirred up the animals a lot more than they had been stirred up before, and made them perceive us as the enemy even more than they had. It drove them bananas.
And that's the point where, to me, Nixon took on the role of a man who was against the press, against radio, against the media, and wanted to shut down what we were doing, if he possibly could.
The president called me.
The Nixon administration launched a campaign of intimidation and threats against the networks. The man spearheading the assault was Special Counsel Charles Colson. His colleagues describe him as a one-man terror.
To me, Colson clawed his way to the top by pandering to the president's worst instincts, which were there. But the president also had always had signals around to make sure that he could blow off steam one moment and not have anything happen. But as I've sometimes put it, the problem with Colson was if you just are blowing off steam and you say, I wish somebody would run over the guy with a truck, Colson would go out and hire a truck.
The White House Chuck Colson was very frank to threaten and say, you go on doing this kind of thing, we're going to use the FCC to make sure that you don't get renewals for some of your television licenses. I mean, they made threats to the economic existence of CBS.
I think the most chilling thing any White House person has ever said was that quote by Colson to Stanton, that we will bring you to your knees in the marketplace. He meant they would use the full power of the White House, of the Republican Party, to ruin the business of CBS. I think that's unfair. I think it's un-American. And I think it's reprehensible.
I want you to hit it frontally, strongly, and toughly. Is that clear?
Nixon so disturbed reporters that he had them placed on the infamous enemies list, and they were subjected to government harassment.
When my file was once read to me, the things that registered for Richard Nixon toward me was Harvard University educated, writer, broadcaster, liberal, not quite accurate, but that's what he thought, Jew, accurate. And that all came together as a very unhappy package.
I got on the enemies list. And after I left NBC and went to work with Robert McNeil in PBS, Richard Nixon and his white-collar brown shirts made our lives unbearable. And finally I had to leave public television. I couldn't get work in television or print for 3 years. And finally, when I was named on the enemies list, my two sons thought it was a great honor. I said, well, considering the fact your father has not been able to find work in 3 years, it's an honor without profit in my own land.
The President of the United States is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors.
The Watergate story broke before Nixon could inflict any damage on the networks.
No. Mr. Rodino.
The excesses of the Nixon administration were seen daily in the households of Americans.
27 members voted aye.
The only network president who was on Nixon's enemies list believes the networks were saved by the Watergate scandal.
That resolution is adopted. Be reported to the House.
I think freedom of the press, freedom of the broadcast media to report what they should report under the First Amendment of the Constitution would have been curtailed. I don't know how far it would have been, but I think there would have been actions of the government. I think we would have lost freedom of the press.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office.
Nixon could no longer fight the tide of public opinion.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President.
A year later, Americans were evacuated from Vietnam. The images of the fall of Saigon would scar a nation. Both the military and the White House learned a hard lesson from this era. Control the images on the screen before they destroy you.